Taehyung sat in his study, his elbows resting on the desk, his face buried in his hands. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the small desk lamp. His eyes were closed, but his mind wasn't at peace. Memories from his past resurfaced, haunting him like shadows that refused to disappear. Flashback, the scene was vivid, almost as if he were reliving it. Aira stood in front of him, her expression cold and heartless. What is this, Aira? Taehyung stuttered, holding up the papers in his trembling hands. Tell me it's a lie. Aira crossed her arms and tilted her head, her lips curling into a smirk. This is the truth, KIMTAEHYUNG. I aborted your child. The words pierced through Taehyung like a dagger. His knees felt weak, his vision blurred with tears. Why, he screamed, his voice breaking. Why would you do that? Because, Aira spat, her voice laced with disdain. You don't deserve to be a father. You're nothing but poor and pathetic. Taehyung's fists clenched as he took a step forward. Aira, he shouted, his voice echoing in the small apartment-like villa. Don't scream at me, Aira replied, her tone sharp. She pulled out a document and slammed it onto the table. These are the divorce papers. Sign them and free me from this miserable life. Taehyung stared at her, his eyes red with anger and pain. How low can you stoop? He asked, his voice dripping with disgust. Aira scoffed. Remember this, KIMTAEHYUNG. No woman in this world will bear your child because you don't deserve to be a father. His hands shook as he picked up the pen, his heart shattering into a million pieces. With trembling fingers, he signed the papers. Get out of my house, he said, his voice low and broken. Aira picked up the papers, her smirk widening. Gladly, she said. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. You can live in this tiny excuse of a villa alone. You'll die alone. And even the child I aborted should thank me for saving them from having you as a father.
The door slammed shut behind her, and Taehyung fell onto the couch, his body trembling as sobs racked through him. Flashback ends.
Taehyung opened his eyes, tears silently streaming down his cheeks. His jaw tightened as he tried to push the painful memories aside. Suddenly, the sound of the door opening snapped him out of his thoughts. He quickly wiped his face and straightened his posture. Mrs. Kim stepped inside, a soft smile on her face. I was knocking, but you didn't hear me, I guess. Taehyung adjusted himself in his chair, offering an apologetic smile. I'm sorry, Mom. I was just lost in thought. Mrs. Kim's smile faded slightly as she walked closer. We went to the doctor, she said, her voice gentle. Taehyung nodded, avoiding her gaze. What did the doctor say? Mrs. Kim sighed, sensing his attempt to dodge the real conversation. Everything is normal, nothing to worry about, but... You were thinking about her, weren't you? Taehyung stiffened, his eyes narrowing. What did the doctor say? He repeated, his voice firmer this time. Mrs. Kim shook her head, understanding his deflection, but deciding to let it go for now. Wyan told me she thought she was infertile, she began. The doctor said there's absolutely nothing wrong with her. Those previous reports were likely a mistake. Taehyung's brows furrowed. She wants to keep the child, he asked hesitantly, almost afraid of the answer. Mrs. Kim laughed softly. She's so happy, Tae, she couldn't believe it at first. And I've told you before, not all women are like that. Which, her voice carried a sharp edge as she referred to Aira. Taehyung's lips curled into a small smile at her words, but his eyes remained clouded with doubt. Mrs. Kim reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. Go talk to her, Tae, she said softly. Taehyung nodded, though his heart was still heavy with hesitation. Tae, Mrs. Kim said softly, while you're thinking about everything, don't you think you owe Wyan an apology too? Taehyung raised a brow, surprised. Me? Why? Mrs. Kim gave him a knowing look. For not telling her about your work yourself. If you had been upfront, she wouldn't have found out the way she did. Taehyung leaned back, crossing his arms. And what about you, Mom? You played your part. lying to both of us. Shouldn't you apologize too? Mrs. Kim dramatically sighed, pressing a hand to her chest. Oh no, my son wants to send me to jail for matchmaking. What a cruel world this is. Taehyung stared at her, unimpressed. Mom, I'm serious. Mrs. Kim shrugged, unapologetic. Tae, I just wanted you both to marry. And honestly, I would have lied more if I had to. Taehyung's lips parted in shock. You really are something else. Mrs. Kim smiled slyly. YN needed someone strong to lean on, someone she could trust and rely on. You needed someone soft to help you heal and move forward. It was a perfect match, Taehyung scoffed. So you got me married to her because you thought she needed me. Mrs. Kim nodded confidently. Yep, Taehyung frowned. What about me? Don't I matter in this equation? Mrs. Kim chuckled. You're a grown man, Tae. You know you're good and bad. I trust my upbringing enough to know you do the right thing. And what if I wasn't good to her? Taehyung challenged, his voice quieter but firm. Mrs. Kim looked him squarely in the eyes. I trust my upbringing, she repeated calmly. Taehyung shook his head in disbelief. You're unbelievable, Mom. Read more greater than Mrs. Kim leaned forward, her expression softening. Listen, Tae, what you went through with her was bad, really bad. It was hurtful and broke you in ways I can't even imagine. But you had me, you had Hymin, Hoseok, Namjoon, Jin, Yoongi. You had a support system. YN had no one, nothing. She was thrown into the middle of nowhere. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't noticed her that day. If I'd ignored her. Mrs. Kim's voice cracked slightly. This world didn't deserve that poor soul. She went through betrayal, accusations, humiliation. All because she was told she was infertile. And the doctor says she was never infertile to begin with. That means she was a victim of conspiracies. And for what? Taehyung sighed, biting his lip, his heart aching for YN in a way he hadn't felt before. Mrs. Kim placed a hand on his. She healed Tae, but today that old wound reopened, giving her a pain she's not showing. She's having a mental breakdown, but she's masking it well. You both are wounded. You both need each other. Share your pain with her, and let her share hers with you. And then, together, share the happiness of this little one who's on the way. Taehyung nodded slowly, absorbing her words. I will. Mrs. Kim gave him a pointed look. I told you to apologize earlier, remember? And instead of agreeing, you asked me why, but YN? She agreed to apologize to you without hesitation, without asking why. Doesn't that tell you something? Taehyung's shoulders slumped as the weight of her words sank in. Mrs. Kim patted his cheek gently. Apologize to each other, forgive each other. Then move forward like nothing happened. Relationships are hard, but they grow stronger when you face challenges together. Taehyung smiled faintly, standing up. Thanks, Mom. Mrs. Kim smiled warmly, pulling him into a hug. Go now, fix things before they become unfixable. In is sitting on the bed, her head resting in her hands, lost in deep thought. The door opens and Taehyung steps in. Noticing her quiet state, he slowly walks over and kneels in front of her. Taehyung, YN lifts her head, offering him a small smile. You heard, we're going to be parents. Taehyung smiles softly, his eyes lighting up as he nods. Taehyung, something we didn't think about, but yes, I heard. YN hesitates before asking, her voice uncertain. You're okay with this, right? I mean, maybe you're not ready for this yet. Taehyung doesn't respond immediately. Instead, he gently takes her hands in his and kisses them tenderly. Taehyung, more than okay. I'm more than ready. We're in this together, no matter what. YN nods, a bit of relief crossing her face. YN, you're sure about this? Taehyung, more than sure. Taehyung hesitates for a moment, biting his lip as he considers his next words. Taehyung, YN, there's something I want to tell you. About my past. YN tilts her head slightly, her brows furrowing in concern. YN, your past. Taehyung nods, taking a deep breath. He begins to explain everything: the pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak caused by Ira. As he recounts the events, YN listens intently, her expression shifting from shock to sadness. YN, how could she be so cruel? Taehyung, there are women who would give anything to feel the joy of motherhood, and she just threw it all away.
Her voice wavers as tears well up in her eyes. Taehyung gives her a sad smile, his hand resting gently on her cheek. Taehyung, it's all in the past now, YN. What matters is the present. But I think it's time we talked about your past too.
In looks down, biting her lip nervously. YN, Taehyung. Taehyung interrupts toughly, his tone reassuring. It's okay, YN. You need to let it all out. I'm here. That simple assurance breaks down her walls. Tears start falling as she sobs quietly. Taehyung immediately pulls her into his arms, holding her tightly as she cries against his chest. YN, what was my fault, Taehyung? Why did they play with me like that? Was I so worthless? So easy to replace and throw away? Her voice cracks with pain, and Taehyung feels his own eyes grow moist. He holds her tighter, pressing soft kisses to her hair. Taehyung, you are not worthless. YN, never think that. You are the most important person in my life. You're my world, my everything. In sobs harder, clinging to him as if he's the only anchor keeping her grounded. Taehyung, let it all out. YN, cry if you need to. Scream if it helps, but remember this: you're not alone anymore. I'm here for you, always. After a few moments, her sobs begin to quiet down, her breathing steadying as Taehyung soothes her with soft words. Taehyung, now, let's focus on our present and our future. YN, on us. On this little one growing inside you. We'll make a beautiful life together. I promise you. In pulls back slightly, looking up at him with watery eyes. YN, you mean it. Taehyung cups her face, his thumbs gently brushing away her tears. Taehyung, I've never meant anything more in my life. A small smile breaks through YN's tears as she nods. YN, okay, I'll try. For us, Taehyung smiles warmly, pulling her back into his embrace. Taehyung, that's all I ask. We'll take it one step at a time, together. The trio sat together at the dinner table, the atmosphere warm but quiet. Taehyung made sure YN ate more, gently placing extra servings on her plate despite her protests. Taehyung, eat a little more. You need it for the baby. YN pouted but complied, taking small bites as Mrs. Kim bit her lip, seemingly lost in thought. As the dinner finished, Mrs. Kim cleared her throat. Mrs. Kim, I need to talk to you both. Something important. Taehyung and exchanged glances and nodded, following her to the living room. They settled on the couch, and Mrs. Kim began hesitantly. Mrs. Kim, I want to apologize to both of you for the problems caused by me. YN quickly tried to interrupt, but Taehyung gently held her back, raising an eyebrow as Mrs. Kim glared at him. Mrs. Kim, I wanted you two to be together no matter what. That's why I did what I did. She lowered her head, sincerely apologizing again. YN shook her head. YN, it's okay, Mom. Taehyung looked amused, raising an eyebrow. Taehyung, okay, that's why you asked for a divorce. In looked away, pretending she wasn't even there. Taehyung, I don't know what fault I had in all this. Taehyung, I don't know what fault I had in all this. One lied to me, and the other didn't even try to let me explain. Both Mrs. Kim and YN looked at him apologetically. Mrs. Kim, I thought we could tell her later, slowly, and she'd understand. She pouted dramatically, making YN smile faintly. But can't you just leave it all in the past? Taehyung shook his head firmly. Taehyung, it's not that easy. This was a one-way road. There's no turning back now. In nodded slowly, trying her best to understand Taehyung's side. Taehyung, you didn't do good by lying to both of us, though. Mrs. Kim huffed. Mrs. Kim, I said sorry, you moron, Taehyung smirked. Taehyung, and you, YN, suddenly asked for a divorce because you thought I had a girlfriend. In glared at him. YN, try me. Taehyung raised his hands in surrender, smirking. Taehyung, really? YN grinned mischievously. YN, I will. And I'll take half of your assets with me. They laughed, and even Mrs. Kim joined in, rolling her eyes. Mrs. Kim, I really wish it's a girl. YN shook her head. YN, but I want a boy. Taehyung frowned playfully, looking between the two women. Taehyung, why not a girl? YN hesitated before replying softly, what if her fate is like mine? Her voice was laced with sadness, and tears welled up in her eyes. Mrs. Kim reached out, placing a comforting hand on YN's. Mrs. Kim, nothing's wrong with your fate. YN, you just met the wrong man once. That's all. Taehyung pulled in into a hug, soothing her as her tears fell silently. Taehyung, you're with me now, YN, and nothing like that will ever happen again. Mrs. Kim sighed, looking at them fondly. Mrs. Kim, you two are making me jealous. I miss your dad right now. Taehyung chuckled. Taehyung, why? Mrs. Kim pouted. Mrs. Kim, because I don't have anyone to hug like that. In smiled through her tears. YN, should we find a dad for us, Mom? Mrs. Kim gasped dramatically. Mrs. Kim, shameless. The trio laughed together, the room filled with warmth and light-hearted banter. They continued talking late into the night, only heading to bed when their exhaustion finally caught up with them.